Hey everyone, welcome to the Retro Aesthetic and the Power of Abstraction panel. We're going to just go around real quick and introduce ourselves. My name is Meg Eden. I teach creative writing at Anne Arundel Community College and University of Maryland. My novel, Post-High School Reality Quest, plays with game form, the interaction with games, and creative writing with the form of a text adventure game.
I'm Vincent. I am a developer and I occasionally work on board games as well. I'm just about to start a master's degree in game design at American University. I've participated in multiple Ludum Dares, with my most recent one being Small World Online this year for the 10th anniversary of Ludum Dare. And I made a board game, Global Crisis, at the 2015 Global Game Jam at MAGFest that won Best Design Game at that particular location. Not overall, way better people making games than me in the global community.
I'm Oliver. I work with MAGFest, and I can beat Mike Tyson in round one. So I have a unique appreciation of the aesthetics of retro gaming and how you have to notice how frame rates can play into artwork. And by the other definition of aesthetic, when the kind of suffering one can do to make them an aesthetic, so. Well, I wouldn't quite say it's suffering, but many people would define being able to do that as a complicated task, and it's definitely intimidating. But yeah, I've also been a teacher for about 9 years, and I enjoy studying games through the lens of history and things like that.
Funny you mentioned frame rates, because I think that's something that we were going to bring up a little bit later.
Something like that, yeah.
So maybe where to start is, how do we want to define the retro aesthetic for this conversation, and why does it fascinate us so much?
I have a few answers for that, and maybe Oliver and Meg have some different definitions for myself, but I would say one of the most loose interpretations of what the retro aesthetic is art that's low resolution, where you can kind of see every individual pixel, and you don't really have smooth gradients between colors, like you can just do with a gradient tool. And on top of that, usually having a limited number of colors in a sprite itself. So you might have 3 or 4 colors for a tile of grass rather than 50 or 60 if you're using gradient-based stuff. How that's made doesn't really matter. You could be like Donkey Kong and start with 3D models and turn that into a very small piece of pixel art and maybe touch it up a little bit to make it look nice, but that I think is a basic loose definition of that. Then you can add restrictions on top of that, like actually going within the 16-bit subset of colors that you can use, like you would on an SNES. There's a limitation to how many colors you can use on that, or on an NES where you would have only 8 bits to represent that, so even fewer colors. And then another restriction you could have would be palette-based. So like the Commodore 64 only had so many colors you could use. It wasn't necessarily based on 8 or 16-bit, but a specific set of colors that they allowed. Or you could do tricks like flickering the color back and forth to get new colors. And then finally, I would say there's a resolution restriction where you just force it down to a very small thing, like maybe 16 by 16 that Minecraft uses. But that kind of is similar to just it's just the resolution restriction. Instead of limiting yourself on colors, you just say it's going to be a very small size.
Yeah. To me, retro is outside of a vernacular definition that we've usually mostly used for slang, but specifically in video games, I think it's always had a mutable definition. And some people would say that it depends on how old you are, but as long as you're emphasizing similarity rather than difference, I think it can mean anything and everything to anyone. But I think from emphasizing the art point of view, I think the great divide would be between the Atari and the NES, and not just for commercial reasons, but when it comes to something that really became complex enough to seem artistic, like if you look at work like Square Painter, I don't know if that was quite as possible with the Atari. So that's kind of like where there's both a physical line that was drawn through the video game crash, and then like a mental line that exists in terms of the complexity of the tools that are used to make the games. And as time invariably marches on, I'm sure they'll come up with new definitions.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Well, and the idea of it kind of being relative, I think, is maybe part of why it fascinates us, because it's something about our history. So depending on whatever we find nostalgic can kind of define what we think is retro and what interests us. Do you guys have any thoughts on why maybe the retro aesthetic is particularly of interest to you guys?
I would say for me, there's at least probably a pretty large component of nostalgia to that. I grew up playing NES, SNES games and playing 486 and whatnot. So, some of my favorite games are from back on the SNES: Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country 2. So when a game manages to capture the feel of those games, either artistically or mechanically, that's something that really kind of brings me back to that time and really. It brings that warming feeling of thinking back on nostalgic things. Thinking of something like Undertale, that feels like it really captures the nostalgia of the old games like Earthbound and whatnot.
Yeah, Earthbound is a game that's kind of like sometimes lacks an identity given the time it was made, but I think the artistic aspects of it work much better in Mother 3 and the original one. It's kind of like the odd man out among the Mother series in many ways, I feel. But for me, I think it comes both from an attempt to understand stuff on a deeper level because of the connections that retro gaming, I'm starting with the NES again, has towards the concept of difficulty, which is, of course, mutable, but in recent times, Mike Tyson being an example, I'm not sure if it's a healthy thing. I'm lucky to have never encountered anyone who really thinks that it's an amazing, significant, life-changing accomplishment because it's all about pattern recognition and keeping calm, mentally focused, like any type of skill. And it's eminently doable. There's not like some huge wall that unless you go through this training or something, there's no way you'll be able to accomplish any of those challenges. And that's part of the mystique of retro for me. Silver Surfer's another one. That only took me about 2 days.
Silver Surfer.
That only took me about 2 days to beat. I expected the way people talk about it, I thought it would take a lot longer. But you start noticing patterns, things like that. And by no means am I saying I'm someone special because of that. I think anyone could learn,
I think he's particularly good at video games. Silver Surfer looks ridiculous.
Of course, you've got to find ways to make it fun for yourself, but I don't think it's like something. I think it's a developed skill, not necessarily an innate one. Innate.
Yeah, I think anybody could learn. It's just, you start 2 days. That I feel like a lot of people would take longer than that. I mean, certainly I would probably give up in frustration after 2 days.
I'm not timing myself, but it's one of those things due to its aura, the aura of invincibility, if you will, like Tyson again. You would think it would take much longer, and you kind of go in expecting that, but that's part of the appeal of it. Kind of like. I guess more than anything to bring it all back to us to say, not like you should be on a higher tier because you can do this, or you should be on a lower tier because you can't do that. I have no use for any of those concepts when it comes to video games.
You're just like, oh, this video game, I just beat it.
Yeah.
But there's something to be said for that, like almost folklore around it of like.
Yeah. If it starts a conversation, good. But if it's used to like say, oh no, you need to go away, that kind of stuff, that's not helpful.
Oh no, that's not.
Yeah.
So the retro aesthetic is kind of coming back in style with a lot of more contemporary games, FNAF, Undertale, Beat Cop are a few that come to mind for me. Why do you think that is? Is that just a trend, or is it become an art form, and why?
For myself, I would say there's a couple reasons for this. One, I already mentioned for myself being the nostalgia. A lot of people who are making games now did grow up in 16-bit era, so they want to recapture something that they felt in their childhood. But also, on a practical side, creating the graphics in a more they look like 16-bit graphics on the SNES are easier than making really highly detailed models and animating them. It can take a lot less time and potentially artistic skill, although it is an art form that can be very difficult. So
It depends. Like Owlboy, didn't that take like forever?
yeah, Owlboy is kind of an outlier in that it took a decade to make. But that one is kind of special in how much art it has and how much care was taken into every given frame. Whereas something like Shovel Knight, maybe somebody could put together the animation for the main character pretty quickly and then maybe refine it over a year or two while the game's in development to make it look even better and really fit what they're trying to go toward with that art style. And also because it, like just said, it is an art form. A lot of people, there's really some serious craft and care that has to be taken to fill that style. I mean, Shovel Knight, it looks simple, but I'm sure it took them more time than you would probably think to put that together and make it look good. When you have so few pixels to work with, every individual one matters, and you probably have to sit there and fiddle with it for days at a time to figure out where exactly that one pixel needs to go in order to make it look good. Or with Owlboy, it's a little bit higher resolution, but it's still going to take time to really make it look good and go through iterations to fit with the style as it currently is, as it's being developed over the lifetime of the product. I mean, I follow the guy who does the art for Owlboy, and he posted like, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like now, and then you kind of have to redo all of your art after that.
Is that the kind of thing, working from the point of view of Super Nintendo, just starting from there, that you would, in expanding on Shovel Knight and Mega Man 9, I guess would be a relevant example? Is that something that you think happens naturally, or they set a line in the sand when it comes to development tools, like say the 46,000 colors, I believe, of the Super Nintendo, and they go like, ooh, that sounds inherently better in every way? Or do they just put up like totems, if you will, about what they're going to be able to use as part of a way to challenge themselves as programmers in defining what they consider to be the retro aesthetic? Or
As in purely
or is
tools-wise?
it would you say more it's influenced by market forces?
They might just put a line in the sand, because I feel like, because you mentioned Mega Man 9 and Mega Man 10 as well.
Yeah.
I remember reading at one point that they were talking about how it was actually more difficult for them to make those graphics than some of the other ones, because they had to go back to this specific art style that they just were not used to. So to do something like that, they would have to sit there and be like, we want to make this. It has to look like this. It has to fulfill these criteria. So they would have to draw lines in the sand in order to be able to fulfill that. And maybe they can use advanced tools like Photoshop to put it together, and maybe use some filters or fancy things like that. But at the end of the day, they have to look at it and say, it has to be within this color palette. It has to allow for this many sprites on the screen to make it look like an NES game. It has to have all these different, it can only be this size textures in order to have that aesthetic. So at some point, if you want to fulfill that aesthetic, you do have to draw a line in the sand. Otherwise, you might start progressing towards something that looks more like a modern game, instead of something that fulfills that kind of pixel art feeling of NES, SNES sort of thing.
And it's probably easier to do than you realize. That's why you got to set those standards, I guess, right?
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's easy to start with something like, again, Owlboy. You start with something that's 128 by 128, and you start fiddling with it, and then next thing you know, it's a 256 by 256, and it has smoother flowing colors and gradients, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, I have to step back and reduce the number of colors here and go back a little bit farther, instead of letting myself go down that path of making it look more realistic or with higher resolution or something.
So do you guys think that's a trend or an art form? Like, why do you think that that's something like that you'd want to restrict yourself to?
Some people might like the challenge. Like I was saying with Mega Man 9, the developers were like, this is hard. So maybe somebody's like, I'm going to do this because it's challenging. I want to challenge myself and my art skills to fit within these restrictions, or because they want to force themselves to be more creative with what they have, instead of relying on the crutch of higher resolution to be able to do something.
Lest they atrophy, or is that not a factor that even comes in when it comes to those skills?
I mean, maybe. I'm not an artist myself, so I can't necessarily say that they don't want to atrophy. But maybe it is just something they look at and say, this would be an interesting challenge. I'm going to do this because it would be an interesting challenge, and maybe they also say that I want to get better as an artist, and not necessarily atrophy, but not stay where they are.
Diverge.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. I think it's a little bit of a marketing thing, because it's an easy answer, especially because even if you view it strictly in terms of sales numbers, I think we still care about it with some reasonable leeway when it comes to Metacritic scores or something like that. Like hopefully they'll make adjustments. The kind of asinine stuff that you'll sometimes see when IGN or GameStop will review old games and they'll give it like a 5 out of 10, even though they gave it a 9 out of 10 when it first came out. That nonsense. That has no purpose. But it seems to be that there doesn't specifically, there's not really anyone at fault if it doesn't work out. It's like a harmless experiment. If it sells, huzzah. If not, they just move on because the budget is obviously comparatively lower. So it seems
Low
like a
stakes.
win-win scenario.
It doesn't take $5 million to make Mega Man 9. It probably took 300,000, and that was purely because programmers and artists are expensive, realistically.
And like you said, there's that nostalgia with this aesthetic. So marketing something, you can market to people's nostalgia and be like, oh, that makes me feel like I'm younger. And like,
Yeah.
maybe I'll buy this game because it makes me remember that. Or
This
something.
looks like Mega Man. This looks like Mega Man original game. I want to buy that because that looks like that. That's so cool.
Exactly.
So kind of on that note, what are some of our memories of the retro aesthetic? Like when we hear that term, what kind of games do we think of from our own experience? And why do you think we remember these games?
Some of the games I remember from when I was a kid and had kind of a big impact on me is stuff like Castlevania, Super Metroid, Raptor Call of the Shadows, if anybody actually knows that. Nice.
Super Metroid, but I remember Raptor also.
Oh, okay. Raptor I think is a little bit more obscure than Super Metroid. Yoshi's Island, Super Mario World. I played Super Mario World a ton as a kid because my mom liked Mario games, so she would play those as well. So that was kind of a bond I had with my parents. Banjo-Kazooie. And yeah, no, I'm listing off all the popular games everybody knows. I mean, they're popular for a reason. And I think of those games because, like with Super Metroid is probably one of my favorite games of all time because I think it has such a great sense of storytelling. It has so little text at the beginning of the game and then tells a powerful story through actions. If you haven't played Super Metroid, you've had so many years, so I'm going to spoil things. The end of the game when the baby Metroid dies, saving you from Mother Brain, that's still
What?
Yeah, I know, right? How dare I?
Everybody.
That still makes me feel emotional because it's such a powerful scene because, you're the one in that scene. It's not the game telling you, you're sad because the baby died. You're the one sitting there being like, I wanted to save that baby, and it remembered me when it found me, and that's so powerful. And it's made more powerful because, when you're a kid and you're seeing those graphics and you grow up and you see those graphics as so much more vivid than they actually were. Good phone, sir. Good phone. One of the most powerful things about that back then is that you saw those graphics as a kid, and they looked better than they did. You look back on a game, and it looks better in your memory than it does when you were playing it. I remember that somebody made a mod that made, I think, Legend of Zelda or something, one of Ocarina of Time, more realistic looking. And people saw that and were like, that's what I remember. That's exactly what I remember it looking like as a kid. And that's so powerful, I think.
Yeah, and like what you're saying makes me think of why I love the Pokemon games so much, like Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Red and Blue, is because you were a participant much more. Like I felt very invested as a player because I'm creating my teams. I'm building a relationship with these specific Pokemon and getting to customize them. So it makes me all the more invested in that adventure as opposed to if I was just handed these things and told like, well, you're an adventurer and you should feel these things.
What you said about Ocarina of Time can speak to like where our memory can sometimes fail us. I mean, that was a limitation of the N64, but in no way is that game realistic. If you look at the concept art, they have giant anime eyes. And unfortunately, it'd be nice to go like, fine, but it affected Zelda for the next several years to the point where people really beat up on Wind Waker because of their perceptions about what a realistic game was, even though Ocarina of Time was not.
Wind Waker was gorgeous. How dare they?
It was a good game, but it wasn't realistic looking.
But the style has remained beautiful. Now we don't look back and go, wow, Wind Waker looks so dated. Like.
Yeah, and I think it's a good, proof is in the pudding type thing. Even you don't have to just say like, oh, you Philistine for not liking it when it first came out, Which I've never understood because there's no evidence in history that the Philistines were particularly anti-art or anything like that. So, just one of those weird things that's entered our vernacular and we can't really explain it.
Wind Waker is a very interesting example with the HD version that came out that doesn't look much different from the original to my eye.
Yeah.
It just looks like the lighting is just ever so slightly better. That's really about it. I mean, everything else looks almost exactly the same, and that's really interesting, actually, that you can have Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time remake that looks better now, but a Wind Waker remake doesn't look much different, and it says something about that art style.
It almost echoes like, I can't think of a better word than ulterior motives, but like this putting it out there, like I guess the most obvious one would be like to help sell Wii U's, but also like to keep the source code updated lest it be lost or something like that, because you're right, aesthetically there wasn't much of a reason for its release. You know? I don't think the original Wind Waker is hard to find or anything like that, so I guess just
To keep it
put the
contemporary.
ducks in the row, make it as available everywhere, and there's a good argument for that to be made also. You know, it should be available everywhere.
Yeah.
You know,
The Virtual Console is a wonderful thing to be able to make a lot of those games available to play right now, like Super Metroid or Chrono Trigger. I don't even know if that one is. I know Super Mario RPG is. But being able to play those games right now without having to go find an old console and buy an expensive cartridge is amazing, by the way.
yeah.
One other thing I wanted to add with memory that I think is really interesting is a lot of the limitations memory-wise that these games had and how that reflects how we interacted with the game. So I think of Pokemon with like Missing No and all these different glitches that would happen. Huh?
No, I was checking, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good.
Oh, to clarify real quick, when she says memory, not our memories, but the
Yeah,
amount
I just
of
realized
memory available to the game on the Game
Right.
Boy.
12 megs, 16 megs, 32
Yeah.
megs.
And they were using
Yeah.
every little bit of that. So, you know, if the
Pla-
numbers were...
Takes up like 25% of the box on Super Nintendo cartridges, boxes sometimes.
And so if that was saved in a certain way, you know, you would get Missing No or Professor Oak. A wild Professor Oak appeared. But what was so interesting back then is that we obviously didn't have these Let's Plays on YouTube available, and we didn't have the same information available. So I remember that creating kind of a folklore on the playground for me of people like, well, this is what you have to do to get Missing No. This is what you have to do. And that whole, like, verbal interaction and not really knowing for sure what exactly this was. That added a mysticism and a, like, I don't know, this amazing experience to games. Like, it really felt powerful, and like I didn't fully understand them back then.
Yeah, the memory limitations are very interesting in old games because of the weird tricks it allows people to do. Think of speedrunning and all the weird stuff they're able to figure out about games. I mean, for Pete's sakes, they can go in Ocarina of Time from the first boss to literally the end cutscene because they are able to manipulate a number to be one more than it's supposed to be, and all of a sudden they're there.
Yeah. And all the optional walls in Donkey Kong 64.
What walls? Walls don't exist in Donkey Kong 64. Yeah.
Not trying to be pedantic, but I think a lot of the things that you guys are attributing to memory are actually just bugs. They're just glitches.
True.
They don't necessarily have to do with the limitations of the system. They have to do with the programmers not quite fully bug testing things. But I think that's actually a more interesting thing because the delivery mechanism was cartridges and it was just like hard ROM. That game is done when it's done. And it goes out and they ship 20,000 copies, and those 20,000 copies have that code. There's no internet, there's no patching. Now we just take it for granted. There's a bug in the game. People complain until they patch it and update it. And
Yeah.
the bug goes away, you don't have the glitch. But all these games that we're talking about, those glitches are permanent. You pick up
Right.
a Super Metroid cartridge or something right now, it's got the exact same bugs that went into it when it came out 20 years ago or whatever.
And that's a good point about the bugs, but I would argue that the nature of bugs has changed somewhat over the years. Because of memory limitations in Pokemon, you know, Missing No can happen, which isn't necessarily something that could potentially happen, but not the same kind of thing.
Different way.
Yeah, it would be a different way. And I mean, if you look at speedruns, they can do really crazy things like overwrite memory in Pokemon in order to write the instructions necessary to go to the end of the game. Whereas in, you know, the Wario game, I don't remember which one it is, the 3D Wario game on GameCube, the best they can do usually is skip things by.
Wario World, I think.
Yeah, they can abuse the collision detection. So it's like logic bugs with not necessarily corrupting memory. So I'd say that the nature of bugs due to hardware changes has changed to some extent. Super Mario has logic bugs more than I would say hardware bugs, like memory limitation bugs, but there's a lot of them in those things because they necessarily had to compress things to such an insane degree that, like, Crash Bandicoot only has 8 extra bytes of memory left over. So you can do crazy things with that.
If glitches are the price we pay, like in Super Metroid, for never having to fight Spore Spawn again, sign me up. You know, I hate that fight. And so I learned specifically how to do the mock ball just for that. And like, there's proof right there that glitches aren't all bad, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Well, you don't like just sitting around and waiting for a few good 5-10 minutes?
Yeah, it's almost like that fight was designed by committee, you know, or something like that, you know? And I mean, Super Metroid is such a superlative experience. Thinking what you said about Megs earlier, it's almost hard to forget because the commercial is so irreverent, just like a lot of, as opposed to the Sega ones, which just tried to be shocking and confused it for irreverent. The one with the dog, killers up against weapons, weirdos, stuff like that. Unfortunately, they did very quickly play into that whole Meg thing. That's 24 megs, that's the least important thing about Super Metroid. But they did try and advertise it from that point of view. I don't think we were fooled. I think even when we were like 10, we liked Super Metroid because of its other more innate qualities, not because it had 24 megs.
Yeah, the atmosphere, storytelling, that sort of thing. The fact that it's solid gameplay.
Absolutely.
But maybe there's like a bragging right. Like, what's the 24
I mean,
I don't know.
hardware has always been a bragging
Yeah.
right, to be fair. I mean, I don't think that's changed ever, but I think it's more of a bragging right these days maybe than it used to be back then, or maybe it's not.
Right now with the Xbox One X,
Yeah.
Seriously.
powerful console, only ever thought
Some design.
Sony did the same thing like last generation or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Themselves did it, but
the PS Pro or whatnot.
nothing else.
And at all this time, my PC is still beating them.
Some designers are more vocal than others. So as time passes, I don't think copyright is necessarily an extent, but it'd be interesting to hear their insight into like if they even ever met with the marketers and like did they just go "Pfft," when they hear stuff like that, about Megs. It's like, no, we're not thinking about that at all. But it'd be nice to hear their thoughts. Even more like contentious figures like Sakamoto, especially with Other M, people. But he was
Oh my
there with
gosh, Other
Metroid
M.
right from the beginning, so I'm sure he would probably use the opportunity to use it for an abuse opportunity. But it'd still be fun to hear his thoughts about that whole process. Like, oh, that's just marketing nonsense. I have a feeling he'd say, or something like that.
The
Of
people
course, he could say something completely different.
The people making the game only care about 24 megs because they're like, oh boy, we need to fit all of this in 24 megs. We need to do some really crazy tricks to do that.
Yeah, and that would actually probably be more in line with it because that's more like the boring answer as opposed to something salacious or something. Though he could do that too. Yeah.
So something that really interests me is thinking about some of the newer games that are taking advantage of retro aesthetic is what would it look like if they were in photorealism? And I think a lot of these games, you couldn't really translate them into photorealism. There's something unique that the retro aesthetic does. So I guess I'd want to ask, like, what do you think that is that the retro aesthetic does that photorealism couldn't do?
A lot of things. The first thing that comes to mind is retro graphics can be a lot scarier. Meg and I have just started playing through Lone Survivor, which is a kind of an old game, I know, but it is terrifying because there's like, I don't know, 30 pixels representing the monsters in that game with this like horrible sound that plays, and that's scarier than it would be if it was photorealistic like Amnesia. If it was like Amnesia, I'd probably look at it and be like, that looks kind of silly, and probably just laugh at it. But because it's, so few pixels, my brain fills in all this information about it that makes it so much scarier than it might be in a higher def version.
I'm not sure about scary, but the shooter by Milton Bradley, no less, Abadox is a good example of gory design and really working from it. I don't know if anyone's ever described it as scary, but it's a good example of unnerving imagery, and they really, especially when you hear Milton Bradley, you think, really? They made a game like that? Actually, I'm not sure they made it. They might have just published it, but the logo is right. It's a good one. I mean, it's like Life Force, in that you're inside a giant alien creature, but they really seem to take more advantage of that, and that's also saying a whole lot because the pedigree of the Salamander Life Force series, from Konami, they weren't novices at all at those kind of games. So maybe it was an aesthetic choice. Maybe they just didn't want to up the gore or factor as much.
I mean, I respect that. At the time, stuff like Mortal Kombat was, I don't know when Abadox and Life Force came out in respect to Mortal Kombat, but and Mortal Kombat was kind of a huge controversy at the time. And I mean, we look at those graphics now and they seem kind of crude, but I mean, at the time they were
kind of.
they were incredibly gory for the time.
Well, I remember feeling so daring playing even like GoldenEye and I was like, oh, it's so bloody or whatever. It's like, yeah. But like kind of on that note with the room for imagination with Lone Survivor, I think of FNAF with the little Atari mini games that like the abstraction that creates makes it much more terrifying to me than the jump scares that are in 3D because it almost puts me in the place of a child playing those older games, and makes me feel the fear a lot more and the lack of power that the protagonist is feeling.
Pulling that kid into the chest of the one animatronic in Atari graphics is scarier than the rest of the game.
Yeah, exactly.
That haunts me way more than anything else in that
Or
game.
I'm always haunted by the purple guy getting eaten by the suit. Like
Oh my
that
gosh.
in pixels is way more disturbing than seeing it in full. And I think it is that pixel art requires us to be participants, and makes us, like you're saying, filling in the gaps and really imagining it more, forming it for ourselves instead of having this fully formed thing of like, here you go.
Yeah, it's using more of your imagination rather than giving you a platter of, this is what it is. It can be nothing else.
Right.
And even though that's on an individual level, if the photorealism would be suggestive that you'd be getting closer to the uncanny valley, and that's, you know, when it comes to collective uncomfortableness. So I think probably in 9 times out of 10, even images we probably were very comfortable with would take on a entirely new, literally dimension also.
Yeah.
And be like, just for a thought experiment, that'd be funny if it didn't require so much resources. It's too bad.
Yeah.
You know?
That makes me think. I wonder if there are any games that actually deliberately use the uncanny valley in order to make something scarier.
Resident Evil 7 does to some degree. The teeth really look messed up in some of the characters in that, in my opinion. And
I don't know if they're deliberately trying to use that or if it's just because it's hitting the uncanny valley.
Yeah.
I'm honestly unsure of that.
Yeah. I just know that people specifically called attention not to the face, you know, because it's the standard hair problems and things like that, but for some reason the teeth, a lot of the characters, because they do zoom in fairly often, people find that to be rather unnerving.
That's
And,
fair.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree, but I know it's been mentioned in various reviews and stuff.
Yeah, I think I've seen that.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about Owlboy too? Because I think that was one of the ones that you were thinking that could not be translated into a different type of graphic. Like the pixel art is really purposeful there, and
Yeah, Owlboy is interesting. It could potentially be translated to 3D, but I feel like it would lose something in the process. Because the way it's created right now, it just has so many charming aspects to it that are, I think, a byproduct of the fact that it's 2D pixel art that's just done so well. And if you did translate it into 3D with like realistic shaders and graphics and stuff like that, it feels like it would feel normal. I'm thinking of something like Gianna Sisters, which might have a similar style. If you took Owlboy and made it 3D, it might have a similar style to the Gianna Sisters game that was made a little while back from Kickstarter. And I think that Owlboy looks more charming because of its art style of the 2D pixel graphics versus what it might look comparatively in 3D. And so, yeah, I don't know why I would say that, and I don't know how much I can analyze why I think that. But I think that that is a true statement that if you brought it to 3D, there would be something lost in the process. And potentially that's because you're adding detail and not letting the imagination happen. But other than that, I don't know what I can say about that.
Would you say that part of the appeal of that game, because I just looked it up, was its development cycle, like which would be much shorter, obviously, in 3D, and that would lose, again, I'm repeating myself too often, but some of the mystique of it. It's a good word.
and the heart too.
Yeah, heart is better. Yeah.
Yeah, if it had a shorter development cycle and they didn't take as much care into the graphics, yeah, it definitely wouldn't. It wouldn't have as much mystique or to it or anything. But because maybe part of it is because the designer for it literally did place and pretty much every pixel by hand. So because I mean that's probably how he did it. He didn't sit there and use like gradient tools or
Right.
something or use 3D
That's
models
just
and shrink
terrifying
them.
to think about doing.
I know, right? That's why it took 10 years.
Yeah.
But he did place every pixel, I mean, for the most part, I'm sure he used large square tools occasionally, so it's not literally every pixel, but by and large, placed everything himself. And so there's something he can build from that and a heart he can put into that because he's controlling every aspect of how it looks and not just relying on a shader to make it look good for him. So I think there's something to be said about doing it yourself, doing everything yourself, to make sure you have the experience you want instead of letting Unreal Engine 4 have something that's just like, and this is how it will look because that's how the shader works. This is how the material looks like.
That's making me think about Undertale too, that the personality that has not only with the writing, but the music and the art. Like I think that the pixel art helps reinforce that idea of its personality.
That makes me think of also of BioShock, but in the opposite way, like not so much making a game into 3D, what would happen, because I happen to believe that BioShock is more ineffective because it's a first-person shooter. I like to think that it would be a better game, not that it's a bad game, but if it had a different genre. Not necessarily 2D or anything like that, but just something else. But when you're describing Owlboy, it reminds me of like the character of Bill McDonough when he talks about like the point of pride and why he does things he does, even though that's narratively, he's a real enough character that you can, it seems like that'd be an interesting to hear insight of the creator of Owlboy if he feels a similar thing, like I will make something harder or more difficult for myself just as a point of pride.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
So definitely, yeah, I would think.
Do we
that
want to take questions also, or or are we going to wait for it?
Yeah, I think I had one more question. We've got a little bit more time, so maybe in about 10 minutes we can open up the questions.
All right, okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I guess the last question I just wanted to throw out for everyone is what can we learn from this retro aesthetic, both from the past and some of the older games that we mentioned, but also some of the newer designs and how people are using it now.
What can't we learn? You know?
That's a good question. I'm blanking on something specific to say about that. Because
Whoops.
I mean, we've talked about Owlboy a whole bunch, so I don't know if I'm repeating myself a little bit here with the note that I've already said, but I mean, it shows that you can make something that is beautiful in this day and age of being able to do 3D graphics that are so detailed with something that uses a simpler technology to render. I mean, you can run Owlboy probably on a toaster pretty much because it's 2D art. I mean, it's so easy to render 2D art these days that you can run it on pretty much anything, but it's still so charming, so gorgeous, so
Charming is a good word, yeah.
yeah, it's so fun to look at. It's so neat. You just look at it and you're like, oh, I love this world. And so you can learn that you can make these cool things even with. Like I said, I mean, Undertale you mentioned as well.
Yeah.
You can make this really cool, empathetic world and play with form with it. Kingsway is another example of how you can play with form using like kind of an older style. FNAF shows us that you can have horror. Lone Survivor does as well.
Well, and it's making me think that the simplicity that design allows us to be able to focus on other elements in a game, and there's a lot that are really letting us ask some really thought-provoking questions. With Undertale, we're having this question about genocide in games and like confronting and interrogating, like when we just automatically choose to kill the opponent. Well, like what if we let the monsters live? And stuff like Beat Cop is really making us think of the complexity of being a beat cop. Papers, Please is making us really think about having some moral dilemmas of like, do I let this person in and like have my family pay the consequences, or do I deny these people that feel very human and real? So like the simplicity of the design allows for us to be able to focus on those other things when maybe photorealism might distract us a little bit more.
Or not allow you to do certain things. Like Beat Cop allows you to do some crazy things that wouldn't be very realistic to do in a hyper-realistic game, and it would probably get your game banned.
Yeah, there's always that
Oh, yeah.
mechanical consideration, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to be aware of that too.
Yeah. You can get away with that in Beat Cop, but you couldn't if it was 3D.
Yeah. One, you might focus more on the horror of the gritty reality than the moral dilemmas that you're facing. You might just be so distracted, like, oh my gosh, that just happened.
All right. Well, I think we have questions already that we.
Great.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, how about you?
So you just mentioned Papers, Please. I hadn't thought about that before, but the fact that that's low resolution graphics in that game prevents you from like reading someone's facial expressions. Along those lines. You can't sit there and do, I forget the name of the game, but there was a game where it was based around looking at people's facial expressions to determine whether or not they were lying.
The Rockstar game?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I forget the name.
L.A. Noire.
Yeah, that one.
So it gives you a really different gameplay from just the art style.
Yeah.
Because you could very conceivably have an L.A. Noire style Papers, Please, where you need to read these people's faces, figure out if they're lying to you, if they're going to do bad things. No, that's not what this is about. This is about something entirely different, and the art style enforces that. So it's really an interesting thing I hadn't really thought about.
Well, it demands that we almost like impose what we would interpret their expression to be too, from the information we're getting, which makes it much more emotionally convicting to me if I'm adding that layer of what they're feeling and what they're thinking. So.
And impose is a good way to put it, because if there's one thing we need to impose is the lessons that if you want to interrogate someone successfully, as Ali Soufan is always talking about with terrorists, you appeal to their ego, you don't torture them, you know? So even though I don't think you can do that in LA Noire, maybe you can, it is a, but you learn through osmosis, you know, and you're not going to say, so maybe even if it would be an imposition like your word, niggling little feelings in the back of our mind, if that gets us to push for a more uniform system that actually would work, rather than obviously criminally illegal actions, then
Right.
I'm all for it, huzzah, you know?
Yeah. Great.
Would you say that limitation yields more, that creates a necessity for commitment to personal stylism versus sort of high realism where you can, you might be tempted to do more copying, or is it just as likely that copying of other people's style?
That's a good question. What do you guys think? Like, do you think we'd still be, does this style make us less or more likely to borrow? Is that interpreting your question?
Right.
Yeah.
I've phrased it as a question, although I definitely have a bias, which is
Yeah.
simplicity yields.
I guess it depends on what responsibilities you feel you have as any part of maybe just a conscientious individual, or right down to the nitty-gritty also. I don't know, you can approach it from so many different ways, I guess.
I think it depends on your objective. I'm thinking of something like Freedom Planet, which is supposed to be a Sonic game, essentially. So they might have taken some influence from how the Sonic games look when they were making that, but maybe not necessarily copying that directly. But if you are going with a simpler style, it might be a lot easier for somebody to express their own creativity or aesthetics in that than a hyperrealistic game where you have to make something that looks hyper-realistic, or you're using something somebody already built. Like I mentioned, Unreal Engine 4, Unity with the shaders. If you're not somebody who knows how to do graphics programming, you're going to be essentially copying the look of a ton of other games out there because you're reusing their exact pipeline for how things will look.
Inferior way.
Yeah, exactly.
It has the opportunity to make yourself stand out with a commitment to severe stylism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Benefit potentially of simplicity.
It's harder to make Wind Waker than it is to make a new 2D art game, I would say. I would say it's harder to make 3D graphics that stand out as something unique into your own than it is to make a 2D game that stands out as something unique in your own.
Well, I think you choose the 2D aesthetic with the motivation of wanting to do it yourself.
Exactly.
And wanting to add your flavor. I know you've had your hand up for a while, yeah.
So what would you consider the lower threshold for retro while keeping the charm? Because as much as I've seen like so many games, especially indie games, exploiting the pixel aesthetic, I haven't really seen much going about the low poly route. I'm not just talking about Star Fox, but also Quake 1, talking about mid-90s, which as you recall is over 20 years
Yeah.
here from today. So, I mean, I know Minecraft, but they deliberately have like a block aesthetic. So
Right.
Yeah.
what do you know out there that's actually exploring this route, and would you consider that charming? Because looking back at a lot of those games from now, they look a little jarring.
So what comes to mind with that question, I'm not sure this is fully that, but it's more of like what I remember those games looking like is like Ukulele almost, like of capturing some of the rare game aesthetic, but perfecting it. I don't know if that fully counts, but that's...
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say Ukulele is a low poly game.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like how I remember
Gotcha.
poly games, almost like it idealizes it.
Yeah.
I think of Fog in N64 games, because that was a classic masking tool, even though PlayStation games did it also, but go on, yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that many games that do low poly. I would say that the low polygon count games can be charming though. On Twitter, I follow a decent number of game devs and people who make art and whatnot. So I do see a decent number of them being like, look at this cool low polygon thing that I made, and it usually looks neat. But it almost feels like it's a kind of worst of both worlds in the way of like difficulty to make, because you have to not only be working on 3D assets rather than a 2D canvas, but you also have to make it look good, because you can make low poly easy, but it would look terrible. And
Texture, that's not
Yeah.
yeah, well, low res texture, that's a good as well. But you have to create a unique aesthetic in 3D with a really hard to make art style, because it's kind of like really low res pixel art, in that you have to work with a very small amount of stuff, and so every polygon counts. So it's very difficult to make that look good. On top of having to write the shaders to make it look good as well. So I feel like maybe not a lot of people do that, because it's kind of like a hardest of both worlds kind of thing. But I would say I do know about Pico 8, the engine for like the low, like retro game aesthetic engine. There are a decent number of people, I think, trying to make 3D graphics in Pico 8, so it might be something to keep an eye on for a low polygon games in the future. Like maybe they'll make something that looks more like Star Fox, because they have such a limitation on what they can actually do in that engine.
Yeah, I think it would be a really interesting thought experiment, because I'm not to the point where I would think that it needs to be redeemed, but the N64, hardly the only offender, but it's such a curious place in gaming history. Without putting too much a fine of a point on it, I'm of the opinion that I don't think 3D should have even been attempted until the Dreamcast, because it's just because of quantifiable stuff like that, but ugly, for lack of a better word. It's hard to the point of it's hard that the game worlds really seem to have difficulty defining themselves beyond generic landscapes. I'm sure there are some. But
It felt like the awkward teen
as opposed to like the
years.
FMV, as opposed to like FMV Laserdisc type games, and those are, I mean, they're technically 3D, but they're not quite the same. So
No, I'd
it's
say
tough.
there are games in that generation that did look good. Crash Bandicoot, Mario 64.
You think so? Yeah.
Oh, I still think Crash Bandicoot looks pretty good. I mean, maybe the HD version looks a little bit better, but I
Well,
think
this is
its
what-
style looks good.
This is what's hard to separate, is like how we remember it looking. Because like I remember DK64, I was like, what? So, like even if I look at it now and I'm like, it's terrible, like I still remember it looking
Yeah.
good versus like it actually objectively looking good.
It has to do with your age, of course, obviously, too.
Yes.
Like if the N64 was you'd be more willing to
my
negotiate
baby.
some of its obvious concerns,
Yeah.
I'm probably very biased about those games I mentioned, by the way.
I'm incredibly biased with the N64. Yes. Did you have a question?
Well, just two things to basically answer his question. For one thing, low poly is very alive and well in mobile games.
Yeah.
True, yeah.
Good point.
Good point.
All play, 100 polygon characters and stuff. The other thing is to look at interesting current low poly experiments. Check out Super Hot.
Ah.
No, it's I don't know what platform it's on, but the version that you want to check out is Super Hot VR.
Yes.
It's
I've heard so many good things about Super Hot VR.
where time only progresses as you move. I heard of that. Like the more you move, the faster time goes, and so it's basically bullet time in the game. You're just like dodging bullets and shooting guns at people and stuff, and all the enemies are these they look like crystalline people, because the shader is just this weird reflective sort of thing, and they're basically low polygon people in like a pure white world. So they've gone for like a really interesting aesthetic that's sort of a throwback retro thing, but not really, because they're using a lot of modern rendering technology to make it look good, but it's the very low polygon people that end up looking like crystals that you're fighting. So
Interesting.
It's interesting.
Great. Any other questions? We've got a couple minutes left. Yes.
Hopefully I phrase this in a way that's actually in line with the panel itself. What are your thoughts on using a graphical technique that kind of emulates something that's like hand-drawn or low polygon? The best example I can think of is cell shading, specifically in Guilty Gear Xrd.
Ooh, Guilty Gear is a really gorgeous game. I mean, something like that I think is super cool. I mean, I'm probably super biased about that, but I mean, Guilty Gear I think looks phenomenal. I love how it actually looks like 2D sprites until suddenly it's not. I think that is the coolest thing in the world, and I love that they're doing that with Dragon Ball FighterZ as well. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm so excited for that game. But I mean, when you say emulating hand-drawn, I mean, are you thinking it's actually 3D, but it looks hand-drawn, or are you thinking like Cuphead as well?
That's what I was thinking was Cuphead.
Yeah. Do you know Cuphead?
I've heard of it, but
You do.
I've only seen it like a little bit.
Yes.
To talk about Cuphead a little bit for your benefit, it's a game that actually does use actual hand-drawn art assets, emulating, what era was it? 40s, 50s, 60s? 1920s.
Yeah, like the old little musical melody, kind of Merry Melody
Yeah.
cartoons.
Oh, cool.
It looks
Yeah, it's
like an
so
actual
cool.
cartoon.
and it's so fluid. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
it looks like an actual cartoon, and they're actually hand animating every single frame. They are drawing it themselves, every single frame of that game. So it looks gorgeous because of that.
That would be interesting to contrast with a game like Epic Mickey, because that's what it tried to
Oh,
do.
yeah.
And I don't
Like,
think
not
it's.
really.
I don't think it tried to. I don't think it really succeeded because it was kind of held down by average gameplay. But aesthetically,
Yeah.
it was certainly an interesting game. And I'm told even the people who like the first one really don't care for the second one at all.
The first second one's not that great as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't think off the top of my head of many other games that try to emulate that kind of style. Guilty Gear and
Melody. Oh, not Merry. I was going with the Merry Melody specifically.
Oh, Merry Melody. Oh, yeah. But the hand-drawn style or Merry
Yeah.
Melody or anything like that, I don't know of too many games that do that. Yes, sir.
I was thinking one that it made me think off the top of my head is I think it was the remake of the King's Quest series where that was sort of
Oh, yeah.
they used like hand painted textures but still like rendered it normally on the card, and they created this really interesting aesthetic of like beautiful like water patterns and like trees and stuff.
That's it's a From Software series also, right? King's Quest?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that is them.
Oh, no, that's King's Field. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Something about 3D Kingsfield?
Yeah, it was a remake of the original like King's Quest.
Yeah.
He said King's Quest, and I realized it. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm correct on this, but I think that's might be called like a painterly style where it's it's all those beautiful hand brushed textures that you're applying to 3D textures. I mean, I think you can get painterly graphics for Minecraft.
In terms of resolution, it's interesting because even games that are, well, the three I can think of, one was more held in high esteem despite a developer who's known for favoring experimental versus user friendliness, first and foremost, Akitoshi Kawazu of the Saga series. Saga Frontier 1, Saga Frontier 2, and Legend of Mana. He was all those games are very watercolorish. And even if you don't like them, most people really admire the aesthetics that they went there. And they all occupy interesting times in history, because like 1998, 1999, and not necessarily just as a contrast, but also to because 2D of any kind was not a priority on the PlayStation. Just look at games like X-Men versus Street Fighter. What a piece of garbage that is, you know? Yeah. So it's interesting they were able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't disagree at all, but I have to point out Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Yeah, that's a remarkable piece, a game.
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure that's an exception to the rule of the PlayStation, though.
Such an odd you think it would have been the opposite, that it would have excelled on the Saturn and it would have chugged on the PlayStation.
It's so interesting that 3D graphics were such a priority on the PlayStation, because it didn't actually have a hardware depth buffer. So 3D graphics were really hard to do and make them look good.
I guess point of pride, all that, and maybe they just really cared about making it good or making something different, as opposed to MTV and all that nonsense, those types of games that said oh no, these games aren't for kids and all that 24 meg type garbage again, you know? Because remember, Toshinden is a good example. They tried their best to convince us that was a new type of game. It wasn't. It was a 2D game. It just looked slightly different, and they tried to pretend it was something different, but it wasn't.
It looked 3D, but it played like a 2D.
Yeah. And that was probably more the marketers more than anything, but they really wanted us to think that the Super Nintendo was so fundamentally different, like Bernie Stolar from the PlayStation, when it really wasn't,
Actually, I just suddenly thought it's really interesting, because you mentioned earlier the Dreamcast was the first time they should have really attempted 3D, but it's ironic that there are probably a majority of 2D games on there, and most games made for the Dreamcast these days are 2D shmups.
I think more than anything, I mean Soul Calibur, because Soul Calibur it looks better than the arcade. So and that's I guess that's why you show it to people, and then I think instantly that argues better than I can what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, fair enough.
So we're short on time, so let's do one more question. I think I saw a hand up. Yeah.
It's me again, sorry. You brought up before about how using certain graphical aesthetics might have actually taken away from the game. Sonic Mania recently came out to positively glowing reviews. Do you think that if it stayed in 3D, like pretty much almost every other Sonic game before it, like most other Sonic games previous, would it have gotten the same reaction upon release?
You have its modern graphics sort of
Right.
thing compared to
Like it had been kind of like Sonic Generations with the 2.5D segments of the old Sonic.
Exactly. Or like Sonic 4 or something like
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I honestly think that maybe not as much. Because I know Sonic Generations got a lot of glowing praise for that game, but when I look at, I haven't actually played Sonic Mania, unfortunately, but I've seen a little bit of it, and I look at the Sonic Mania graphics and I compare to what I've seen of Sonic Generations, the side-scrolling stuff, and it just doesn't look as interesting in Sonic Generations as compared to Mania, personally, and maybe that's my own aesthetic feeling for how like what something should look like and what looks good, but I think that the 2D graphics of Mania allow it to kind of capture something that Generations might not have.
The Sonic Advance series, even though I hadn't played them, I'm pretty sure they sold all very well and were critically acclaimed. I have played Sonic Rush, and that game is really good. But I don't think it sold well or was really praised. So it'd be interesting if like they released Mania and Rush and like right side, because again, marketing, Sonic, it has all these aspersions about speed, but Sonic Rush is one of the few games where you are constantly moving fast, as opposed to like stages like Labyrinth Zone are far more common in Sonic than we realize, because the marketing really got into our brains and stuff like that, and
It's a standard platform
really
game.
interesting.
Well, I don't want to say standard, but it's a platform game at heart, even though a lot of people don't want to qualify it as such.
yeah.
It is.
I'm not sure why, because that doesn't make it bad, it just makes it different.
Sonic Colors, what's your take
Yeah.
on Sonic Colors?
I haven't
I
played
don't
that
really.
one.
I know a little bit about that game. I haven't played it. I've seen a chunk of a playthrough of it. And that one,
Soundtrack in the entire series.
I would say it's one of the better 3D ones, other than maybe Generations, but it still felt like it was, I don't know, there's something that didn't feel quite right about it. Maybe it's because you had to get those power-ups to do movement occasionally, and that felt like it might have slowed it down a little bit or felt a little awkward. I can't say too much about it because I haven't played it personally, and I've only seen a little bit of it, but
Nor I.
yeah, but I would think it's probably one of the better ones, and tried to do something different.
So many games to play, so little time.
I know, right?
That's always the struggle.
I do want to say something quickly about the side-scrolling Sonics and how you say there's not focused on speed. I found it ironic that the 3D Sonic, the other type of gameplay in Sonic Generations, is actually more focused on speed than the 2D versions.
Yeah.
Because all it is you go fast down a lane.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about out of time, but thank you so much for being here. We'll stay after, so if you do have additional questions or you just want to chat, you're welcome to come up and talk with us.
Yeah. Let me show you.